At my wife's memorial, my son-in-law slid a pen across a folded document and whispered, initial next to the flowers, Martin. By sunset, a deputy was bagging that paper as evidence, and I was walking into court wearing the same suit I was supposedly too confused to button. The judge lifted her eyes, invited my in-laws to speak, and then very calmly asked why their fingerprints were on the forged will. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. My late wife Nora always said lilies smell like memory. The scent hung in the church air, heavy and sweet, and the black ribbon around my wrist, the one June tied there with solemn ceremony that morning, pressed a faint notch into my skin each time I flexed my hand. The parish hall buzzed with casseroles and condolences. People spoke softly to me as if grief were a skittish animal that might bolt if startled. I nodded, I took paper plates I would not eat from, I repeated the same words, "Thank you for coming. She loved you all." Then Gavin leaned in. He wore a navy suit too tight across the chest, buttons straining with every mock-sincere breath. My daughter, Elise, stood behind him, her face pale, lips cracked from worrying them all week. On a table between us, beside a vase of stargazer lilies, sat a white envelope a little too stiff to be stationary. Gavin placed a pen on top of it, the click of plastic against paper crisp enough to sound like a decision. "Initial next to the flowers, Martin," he said, voice pitched for my ears alone. The pen rolled, tapped the vase, settled parallel to the envelope's edge the way a salesman might line up a contract. I looked at Elise. She would not meet my eyes. Her gaze floated over my shoulder and away, as if something on the far wall had become urgently interesting. Her hands clasped and unclasped around the strap of her purse. I saw her wedding band flash dull gold, and for a breath I saw Nora's hand next to mine on the steering wheel that last Sunday we drove out to the orchard, the sunlight tangled in her knuckles, the place on her ring where the gold had worn to a thin satin. I did not touch the pen. Instead, I slid the envelope toward me with the back of my fingers. The flap was already open, a small, polite mouth. Inside, I could see the edge of thick paper, legal weight, cream, the kind law firms prefer because it feels like a promise. My name in a formal typeface stared up like a verdict. I nodded as if I were squinting to find a line that needed a date. Gavin was ready to be patient with the old man. "Just by the lilies," he repeated, and his breath stirred the fringe around the lily stamens. The pollen dusted the rim of the vase, a sulphurous sun. I closed the envelope and handed it back to him with 2 fingers. He masked his irritation so quickly a lesser I would not have seen it. But I have been looking at men like Gavin for 60 years, at work sites where a foreman smiled and stole, at parent-teacher conferences where a father's handshake promised help and delivered pressure, at hospital billing desks where clerks talked like friends and typed like creditors. Later, I said. Nora would have squeezed my elbow then, a private signal passed through skin, and I would have settled. But Nora was beyond signals now, beyond skin. She was lilies and memory and the thud of dirt that would follow the last hymn. Gavin tucked the envelope under his arm, its throat still open, and moved on to shake hands with Pastor Grace. I watched him smile, warmly, convincingly, with a performance that would have been impressive if I had not already seen his rehearsal. The day slid forward on greased wheels. The hymns were sung. The slideshow played. Nora's nurse cried. The old ladies who had taught Sunday school with her pressed me into soft embraces that smelled like powder and comforting lies. Everyone said the right words in the right order. They were kind. They were faithful. They did not know that a war had begun behind the table of lilies. By the time Elise had fallen asleep on our couch, though I had already begun to think of it as a remnant rather than a thing in use, and June had been tucked into Nora's old guest room. A deputy was in my kitchen. He wore the patient expression of men sent to fetch evidence from the grieving. His name tag read Finch, and Nora would have teased him about being named after a bird from a book. He accepted coffee he did not drink and listened to me explain slowly, carefully, how a man had put a pen in my hand and asked me to initial a floral arrangement as if the church had begun the tasteless habit of charging for condolence blooms. Deputy Finch lifted the paper by its edges with those white cotton gloves that make men look both delicate and important. He slipped the envelope into a clear bag that crinkled like frost. He did not parse legal documents, he collected them, tagged them, did his part to pluck threads for lawyers to tug. He looked tired. He looked appropriately sorry. "I will need a statement, Mr. Shaw," he said. You have it all written down here." "Every word," I said. He nodded toward the notebook on the table. The notebook was leather, the same one Nora had given me the year I retired. She had written to the man who notices in the front cover. She said it was my superpower, noticing. That I took in details others treated like atmosphere. I did notice. I had noticed the ridged callus on Gavin's thumb where a man with a phone addiction sometimes grows skin that looks and feels like a seam. I had noticed the slight perfume of grapefruit and vetiver that his mother, Lorna, preferred, clinging to the envelope in a whisper of her participation. I had noticed the casual way Elise had looked away rather than fight. I had noticed my own hands, steady as stonework, despite the tinny feedback of grief in my ears. By sunset, the evidence bag coldly gleaming under Deputy Finch's arm caught the orange of the last light, and I followed his cruiser to the courthouse. I did not wait to be told a date. Some battles you do not schedule. You step into them because you know that if you sleep first, you will wake to a home with changed locks. I walked into the courtroom wearing the same dark suit I had worn to stand beside Nora's coffin. Elisa's in-laws were already there. Victor sat with his legs crossed ankle to knee the way rich men do, and Lorna had folded her hands in her lap in a manufactured posture of sorrow. Gavin stood behind them at an angle, chin lifted, mimicking a stance he had seen in a leadership seminar. They called my name and asked me to sit. The judge, a woman with eyes that suggested she had learned to balance compassion and skepticism with long practice, lifted her gaze. "I will hear from the parties," she said, and then very calmly, like a teacher asking children who have been caught to describe their arithmetic, she asked why their fingerprints were on the forged will. I did not smile, but I wanted to. I need to go back to the beginning of the end, a month before Lily's, when Nora whispered to me with a tired mouth in a room that smelled like lemon disinfectant and loss. "Do not let them take the orchard, Mart," she said. "Promise me." Our orchard is 10 acres of old trees that do not care who owns them. They bear because they were planted by hands as stubborn as my grandfather's, and because every spring I prune and every autumn I thank. The original deed is soft at the folds from 3 generations of men and women smoothing it open and pointing to a line that says our name. Beyond the orchard, there is the house with my fingerprints in every beam, a small hardware store in town where the bell on the door rings my childhood, a fishing boat that never saw the wrong kind of storm, and some money that sits in accounts the way stubborn-shouldered soldiers sit on a bench, waiting to be deployed to places where family wars require funds. Gavin and Elise had married 10 years ago under an arch I built from old cherry limbs and ribbon. Gavin cried when Elise walked down the aisle, and it is possible that in that moment his feelings were genuine. It is possible everyone is genuine at a wedding. But weddings end. Mortgages begin. The bills that come with the first baby and the second baby do not respect sincerity. Gavin started a boutique renovation company that specialized in reimagining. His website showed photos of families smiling in kitchens where the countertops were bright with quartz and aspiration. He posed with his tape measure like a man measuring the future. He took deposits he spent before he had hardly bought tile. He smoothed over mistakes with charm. He is good at being good enough until it is too late to ask for your money back. His parents, Victor and Lorna, owned a chain of consignment stores that always looked one day away from their grand opening, price tags fluttering like flags of a perpetual sale. Victor wore shoes with a shine that suggested he never walked on grass. He had a handshake with just the right amount of squeeze and a way of saying your first name like he had weighed it and found it acceptable. After Nora's diagnosis, they began their campaign of kindness around the edges. Lorna arrived with soups that tasted like water and hugs that lingered longer than etiquette demanded. She folded laundry I had already folded. She replaced Nora's hand cream with a brand of her own choosing because the scent was more cheerful. She told Elise that grieving is exhausting and that oversight was love. It sounded like help. It looked like the first stones of a path laid toward a destination I would not have chosen. Then came the legitimations. That is what Victor called them, the documents that made a family more efficient. He suggested we make a list of all the things Nora handled so we could make sure nothing fell through the cracks. Insurance renewals, property tax deadlines, the schedule of quarterly distributions from the investment account I had never bragged about because money bragged about wants to leave you. He suggested a family meeting. He brought pastries. He set papers on the table between lemon bars and memory. This is just formalizing what we have been doing anyway, Victor said. We will put Elise as secondary. For convenience. Convenience is the first language of a thief who wants you to open the door yourself. I smiled and opened my leather notebook and wrote in the exact language of the documents I would never sign. I am 65 years old. I am a widower who can button his suit. I am an embarrassingly slow eater now because the dining room chair across from me is empty. But I did not make my living by letting men like Victor drive forklifts through my boundaries. I noticed. Nora had called it my superpower, but it is simpler. I have learned that the person who notices first survives better. The day after the family meeting, I found a new pill organizer on my kitchen counter. The old one I had used for years sat in the sink, curiously wet. The new one was filled, wrongly. My beta blocker had been doubled. The sleeping pills I had never taken had appeared in the evening slot with the cheerful label of rest. The aspirin was gone. I heard Lorna humming in the living room, her voice a no-key lullaby, her hands arranging Nora's photos into groupings a decorator might suggest if a decorator did not know anything about the stories behind the frames. I closed the organizer and slipped it into a drawer. I slid the old one back onto the counter and filled it correctly, clicking each little lid shut like setting mousetraps no one would see. There were other little gifts. A raised bath mat appeared, its adhesive underside impossible to remove without effort I did not care yet to spend. It bunched at the door and, if I had lifted my foot without looking, would have sent me forward into the tile. I cut it out with my utility knife in thin, patient strips, and threw the pieces into a contractor bag like a butcher dealing with something he did not plan to eat. A social worker from Adult Protective Services called and said she had received a report of cognitive concerns. She read questions from a careful script: what day is it, who is the president, count backward from 100 by 7. I answered, and then I offered her coffee. When she came to my house she looked at my neatly labeled and correctly filled pill organizer. She left with an apology that almost sounded like an admission that she knew who had called. My mail began arriving opened. Elise said, maybe the flap glue is weak, and I said, maybe, and I bought a post office box. My insurance agent called to confirm I wanted to downgrade my property insurance to a level that would not cover a kitchen fire. I told him no and asked nicely that he put a note on my file that any calls requesting changes must be made in person. He agreed. He did not ask why. Men my age often look like they have complicated families. It saves time if everyone pretends that we all do the best we can. The last kind act came the week before Nora's memorial. Victor offered to help with the trust that Nora and I had updated the year after June was born. It is ancient, he said. The law changes all the time. He smiled the way a dentist smiles before he tells you the root canal will not hurt. I met with our attorney last Tuesday, I said. It was true. I had met with Miguel Alvarez, who had been a public defender back when all his suits looked second-hand and now wrote spreadsheets that made complicated legacies behave. Miguel had listened to me explain the kind acts. He had nodded in that slow way that means a man recognizes a pattern. He had asked me whether I had cameras. I did, though it embarrassed me to say so. After we returned from the hospital for the last time, I had installed a small silver doorbell at the front door, and I had placed 2 little lenses in corners that would not offend even fastidious guests. They were not for catching thieves. They were for catching forgetfulness. I wanted to watch myself decline in case decline came, to know the moment when I turned away from the stove and did not remember to return. Instead, those tiny glass eyes caught kindnesses I had not asked for. Miguel took notes. He tapped a finger against his lower lip in a rhythm that would have been silly if the stakes had not been my whole life. I want you to consider something, Martin, he said finally. Set something they cannot resist. Then ask yourself what I asked myself in my first year of practice when I learned how stupid men get when they smell other people's money. Where will their fingerprints be? I would rather this did not get dirty, I said. He lifted his palms. It is already dirty. I am suggesting you lean into the stain so a judge can see it. I went home and made coffee strong enough to use as paint. I pulled down Nora's recipe box because when I am frightened, I want to hold a thing she touched. The recipe for her almond cake was there, spattered with batter and annotated in her tidy hand. Bake until the house smells right. I could not bring myself to bake, but I could make plans in the kitchen where she had baked, and maybe she would approve because I was doing a thing the house would remember. I set a decoy document on my dining room table, its font and margins borrowed from a publicly available template that looked enough like a will to make a greedy person's mouth water. It left everything to Elise. Everything. The orchard, the store, the accounts, the house, even the boat that still has Nora's sun hat shoved under the seat. It had a place where an old man might initial to acknowledge receipt of flowers from the memorial committee. It had 3 pages behind the first, blank, so there would be something to thicken the lie, and the last page, the signature page, bore a gentle smear of the kind of powder a hardware man can acquire without a warrant. Under a cheap ultraviolet flashlight that powder glows a smug purple. On skin it is invisible. On paper it sits like polite dust. On glass it sings. I did not know whether Elise had told Gavin anything about the trust. I did not know whether she knew herself what the trust said, because we had not wanted her to carry that weight, not with June's spelling tests and swim lessons and the way the world had blurred when Nora's hair fell onto her pillow in fragile clouds. We intended our daughter's inheritance to be a blessing. Gavin and his family intended any inheritance to become a resource to plunder. I set the decoy where a man with a navy suit would place his hand to lean in and whisper. He did not make me wait long. When he arrived early at the church, before the first hymn had stiffened the air, he waved the envelope at me like a promise to handle something for me. I had already filed the real trust with Miguel. I had already created an addendum that named June as a beneficiary with conditions so protective they looked almost like spite. If Elise stayed married to Gavin when June turned 18, the trust would bypass her completely for the next decade and pay directly for the child's education, housing, and any venture she could document to the trustees' satisfaction. If Elise sought counseling, separated, and stayed away from Gavin's parents for 2 years, her portion would be restored. I had written those provisions through clenched teeth and then cried over them because I did not want to command my daughter's life from a desk. I wanted to hand her a key and watch her turn it into her own choices. But love sometimes looks like a locked gate. The deputy's evidence bag held Gavin's gratitude that afternoon. It held the glow powder on his fingers from when he adjusted his cuff mid-whisper and pressed his thumb against the decoy margin. It held the smudged curve of Lorna's forefinger where she had touched the bottom corner as if to weigh the document in the air. It held Victor's index finger, applied in a paternal tap when he instructed Gavin to keep such important items secure. Courtrooms have their own weather. The air buzzes, the wooden pews unyielding under the thighs of people who do not usually sit without purpose midday. When the judge asked the question about fingerprints, the clouds in that room changed direction. Victor tried first. He was a man who took pride in going first, in offering an answer so simple that to disagree would make the questioner seem ungracious. He said that in a time of grief, families often help with paperwork. He said that if their fingerprints were on it, it was because they had moved it aside to make room for casseroles and kindness. He made grief sound like a room full of boxes. He made me, an old man in a good suit, sound like a person lucky to tie his shoes. The judge listened with an absolute stillness that made Victor hurry. She did not tilt her head. She did not scribble. She did not do the sympathetic eyebrows women sometimes perform as a courtesy when men are lying to them in public. When he finished, she turned to the deputy. Deputy Finch spoke with the flat cadence of a man whose words are used for records. He described arriving at my house, receiving the envelope, bagging it without touching the contents, and delivering it to the evidence locker where, under ultraviolet light, certain smears glowed. He explained that he was not a forensic scientist. He explained what he did not know because that is what men like him are trained to do. Then he raised his hand and showed the judge a photograph that the bailiff took between a rock and a hard place. The photograph showed the top page of the decoy document under ultraviolet light, edges of fingerprints illuminated in violet arcs. The judge waited for my daughter. Elise stood. For a terrible second, a terrible minute, I saw the girl she had been, standing in a bathing suit at the deep end for the first time, arms squeezed around herself, deciding whether she trusted me enough to jump into my hands. She had a way of pressing her lips together when she was bracing for something cold. Her lips pressed now. "We were told," she said, and her voice trembled on a plank she had laid herself. "We were told it would be easier for Dad if all the accounts were in one place. Gavin said his parents knew people who could streamline. He said Dad might get confused later. I did not think we would be here." Lorna's head snapped toward her son in a movement she would tell herself later was motherly. Gavin's face flushed in a blotchy pattern that made the tendons in his neck look like violin strings. "Ms. Shaw," the judge said, and she made my daughter's name a warm place to step. "Who told you your father would be confused later?" Elise swallowed. She lifted her chin the way Nora used to lift hers when a nurse's assistant made a suggestion she did not agree with. Gavin did. And Victor. They said we needed to protect Dad. They said we should get him to sign while he understood. Miguel had told me that we could win legally but lose the people we were trying to save. I sat and listened and tried not to look victorious. The room was a tilt. The judge issued a temporary restraining order on any accounts and property in my name. She ordered an immediate forensic review of the document. She permitted me to change the locks on my house without notice to any party except my daughter. She suggested, and by suggested I mean commanded, that my in-laws refrain from any contact with me that did not go through counsel. She scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks later to determine whether the district attorney would file charges. By the time we got home, the lilies had begun to brown at their edges. The house smelled like a party that had forgotten to leave. I set the casserole dishes in a line and washed them one by one, heavy Pyrex clunking against porcelain with a sound that summoned every kitchen in which I had eaten at the table of someone who loved me. June slid a stool across the tile and climbed up to dry. She rubbed each dish as if the vigor could polish away human failing. Her hair smelled like watermelon shampoo. She hummed without knowing, and it took me a moment to realize she was humming the hymn we had sung for Nora. "Grandpa," she said, and the word pooled in the room like a good rain. "Are you mad at Mommy?" I dried my hands and stood very still. Children smell falsehood the way dogs smell fear. "I am not mad at Mommy," I said. "I am sad." "Those are different things." "What is the difference?" June asked. "When you are mad, you want to hit. When you are sad, you want to hold." She nodded as if I had said something useful enough to keep. "Are we going to the orchard on Saturday?" I said yes. I would say yes to the orchard until I could not stand on my own legs. The orchard was my truest yes. I did not sleep much that night, and in the small hours, when the house hums and grieving men think about wood grain and mortgage math, I opened the top drawer of Nora's desk and found a list she had been keeping for months. It is a thing high school English teachers like Nora do, they make lists. This one was titled Things That Are Ours. It had the house, the orchard, the store, the boat, the accounts, June's drawings, the red casserole dish with the chip in the corner, and a line that made my throat close: "What mattered of our marriage, which is not money." I folded the list and put it in my wallet behind my driver's license. I am 65. I still drive. Their next move did not wait for the official hearing. On Tuesday morning, a man in a polo shirt with a company logo that tried too hard knocked on my back door because grifters always avoid front doors when they can. He said he had a work order to install grab bars in the shower and to do a home assessment for fall risks. There were forms. He slid them toward me, and if I had wanted to sign away the house, the orchard, and my name, I could have done so with the beautiful efficiency of modern paperwork. "Who paid for this?" I asked. "Family plan," he said. "It is bundled with the memory care consult." I almost admired the creativity. They had begun building the file that would present me to a probate judge as a man in decline. Even if the will forgery failed, a guardianship hearing could deliver them the same feast. All they needed were photographs of grab bars I had agreed to, a receipt indicating a memory consult sent at their request, a note from a nurse who had spoken to me while I was tired and taken my pauses for confusion, and a family ready to testify with clean hair and pious disappointment at the indignities of aging. "Come in," I said. He stepped onto my back mat and left a neat rectangle where his boots pressed. I guided him to the bathroom and stood in the doorway while he measured the wall. "Do you have a copy of the work order?" "Of course," he said, and he handed me the clipboard. I read the header, Lorna's signature, a little heart drawn for the dot of her I. It occurred to me that some hearts are born misshapen. "Thank you," I said, and I went to the kitchen and made phone calls. Miguel told me to be patient. Patience is not my natural mood, but grief had sanded me down to a quieter grain. I called the company and asked them to cancel the work order. I asked them to note the file with a message that said no one was permitted to request services from my address without my in-person authorization. I asked them to email me that confirmation. I asked because one asks first. If asking fails, one fights. When the email arrived, I printed it and slid it into the folder Nora had labeled finances in her schoolteacher's script. Then I turned the camera view from the living room just so, in case someone with a key decided to do a home assessment alone. Wednesday afternoon, the social worker returned, apologetic and dutiful. She asked me to explain again that I had not called. I explained again. She asked if anyone had tried to get me to sign something at the memorial. I described the lilies without saying their smell turns to sugar and rot after 3 days. She frowned as if the scent had found her. I will note the file, she said. And I will flag the report for supervisory review. That is the government's language for this stinks and we know it. I would like to say that Elise called that night and said what we all needed to hear, the lines that push a story toward a neat second act. I would like to say she came into the house without knocking, fell into my arms, wept, promised, renounced. Life is not a scene written by a man with a pencil and a grudge. She texted a heart. She asked if June had eaten. She said she was tired. She did not say that she was grieving the mother who had taught her to braid her hair. She did not say that her husband had told her that grief makes men easy to manage. She did not say that in bed, next to him, she was staring at the ceiling and counting little points of light on the smoke detector instead of sleeping. I am not a man who believes the worst thing about a person is the truth. People are cavernous, dark, echoing, full of strange structures made by water and time. Elise and I had traveled the caverns of each other's lives since she was a baby with hair that stood up like a crown. In this cavern, the echoes were unkind. The hearing arrived like bad weather you can see from your porch. The courtroom again. The same judge. A new man at the prosecution table whose eyes were sharp enough that I liked him on sight. Miguel sat beside me. He does not dress like a public defender anymore. He has suits that fit. He does not waste them on expensive ties. He wastes them on other people's battles. The forensic lab report was brief, as if the scientist had been offended by the idiocy before him. The decoy document was printed on paper that had been stored in a house where a grapefruit vetiver scent was common. The ultraviolet powder smeared along the edges in patterns consistent with human fingerprints. The prints matched Gavin and Lorna. A partial matched Victor. None matched me. My in-law's attorney tried to argue transfer. He tried to argue grief. He tried to argue that we could not punish people for trying to help. The judge let him exhaust himself, and then she read the law as if it were a lullaby that would put nonsense to sleep. She referred the matter to the district attorney for charges of attempted fraud, forgery, and something with a name so long it sounded like a ladder you climbed to jail. She granted my request for a protective order and cautioned Elisa's counsel to advise their client that any further attempts to change my legal position without my direct consent would be considered a violation. She did not take delight in doing so. She looked like a woman who had done this before for other old men in good suits and was tired of it. Victor stood on the courthouse steps and said regrettably to a camera that someone had called because the story of this town needed a villain and he knew how to play one. He said family disputes happen, but no one would be foolish enough to try to benefit from a widow's death. He said our family would heal. The camera liked his vowels. It made him look like a person who donated to children's museums. I went home and did not turn on the television. June met me at the door with a stack of construction paper drawings, each one a careful study of apples. She had drawn them in profile, then head-on, then sliced, the seeds like little brown commas. "For the orchard," she said. "So it knows I am thinking about it." Here is the truth. I woke to the morning after the judge's questions. My in-laws did not want me dead. Not yet. They wanted me to become a story they could tell. He is confused. He mixes up his pills. We have to help. He was not always like this, but time is cruel. They wanted to be applauded in court for removing a burden from a girl who had lost her mother. They wanted to pivot from thieves to saviors with a line reading any community theater would accept. Their creative cruelty would not look like malice, it would look like concern. The damage would be the same. If I needed a single reason to fight, other than Nora's last whisper, other than my name on a deed that my grandfather had signed with a pen that left grooves, other than 10 acres that set their own clocks, it was June standing in my hallway with her pictures of apples. I want her to know that when they came for us with paper and voices dipped in sympathy, I did not go. I found my steel. The days that followed were a series of doors opening and closing on purpose. I went to the hardware store and told my 2 employees, men I had known since they were boys who ran the aisles with their hands out to feel the smooth handles of shovels, what was happening. I asked them to route all deliveries through me and to sign nothing with my name without hearing my voice. I had the locks rekeyed on the house and the store and the workshop at the orchard. I changed my post office box again, even though it irritated me to learn a new number. I told Pastor Grace the truth without gentleness. Her mouth set in a line I had seen when she spoke against people who used religion as a cudgel. She said she would call on Elise and talk about covenants. When you set your force in motion, the world often yields its quiet allies. Ruth, who had been a notary for 30 years and had stamped more signatures than most judges had read, brought me a casserole and, without asking, went through every folder in Nora's desk to create an index in her square hand. She wrote in pencil, as if the pencil could be erased if we lost. "We will not lose," she said, as if she had heard me think a sentence I had not spoken aloud. Miguel traveled between court and my kitchen, leaving behind legal pads with lines that became barricades. Deputy Finch stopped by once to ask how I was sleeping and left with a bag of apples because sometimes kindness looks like pretending a conversation is casual. Then came the call I had expected and dreaded, Elise, voice raw from an argument I could hear all the way down the line. "Dad," she said, "I think I need to stay at your house for a while." The relief that followed is a dangerous thing. It makes you want to say too much and forgive too quickly. "Come," I said. "Bring June. Bring what you can carry with your hands. It is an old test in our family. If a thing requires both hands to carry, you might need it. If not, leave it." She arrived with 2 suitcases and a box of picture frames. Gavin's parents stood in my driveway in their car, engine idling, faces composed. They thought they would be invited inside to talk. They were not. Lorna lowered her window and called to June, using a pet name that had never sounded right in her mouth. June waved solemnly and then turned her face toward the orchard where the late summer light made the leaves look like copper coins trembling before a toss. Elise cried like a woman who had known for months she would. She slept like a person who no longer believed in sleep. She gave me her phone. I put it in the hall closet beside the board games we play on nights when weather and grief trap us in the pleasant box of the living room. Victor called for 3 days straight. Then he stopped calling, and that worried me more. In the middle of this, I did one more thing that looked to others like sentiment and to me like issuing orders to the future. I formed the Nora Shaw Foundation out of the trust. Miguel drafted the papers with a briskness that made even his caution feel like momentum. The foundation would own the orchard and the hardware store. Its charter named their purpose as community trades education and food stability. We would teach kids who like to fix things how to fix them better. We would give crates of apples to anyone who wanted to press cider in their garage or bake pies for neighbors. We would hand out hammers and instructions to a boy who wanted to build a chicken coop for his mother. The foundation would pay the property taxes and the wages. I would draw a salary for maintenance. If I died, Ruth would be the trustee, Miguel the counsel, and June the beneficiary of a scholarship with a description I wrote after midnight with Nora's list on the table beside me, projects that are useful, beautiful, or both. I signed the documents in front of Ruth in my kitchen. The pen felt heavier than the one Gavin had slid across the lilies. When I placed it down, my hand shook just enough that I knew my adrenaline had been talking more than I had. Miguel filed the foundation papers at the county clerk's office and then at the state's portal, because the modern world wants you to say yes in duplicate. He sent me the confirmatory emails, and I printed them and slid them into the finances folder. I could hear Nora in my head teasing me about my love of paper. I loved it because it does not forget the way men do. The next morning, at 5:45, the river of kindness that flows through small towns found its current. The county sheriff called to say a warrant had been issued for Gavin's arrest on charges connected to the will forgery. He said he could turn himself in quietly or be picked up noisily. I chose quietly, because I did not need more spectacle. The sheriff agreed. I told Elise she would be reading about it by lunch, and she nodded, a small, scared movement that made me want to call everyone in the world and lecture them about hurting my girl. By noon, the entire town knew. You cannot arrest a man like Gavin without making a sound that echoes. His parents put out a statement. The words were familiar by now: misunderstanding, grief, complicated family dynamics. The statement said nothing about fingerprints. They pivoted to Plan B within days: guardianship. Their petition to the court said I was a danger to myself because I had a workshop full of tools and no one should allow an elderly man to operate a lathe. It said I was hoarding cash because the kitchen safe I kept, the one I have had since a spate of burglaries in 1989, held $7,000, a number they learned by watching me one afternoon with a camera in their car. It said I was delusional because I believed they were trying to hurt me. It said I had forced Elise to leave her marital home. It said I might abscond with June. Miguel slit the envelope like a surgeon and read the petition at my table. He smiled once, a small, feral expression that said the man I had hired still remembered what it felt like to stand before a judge with nothing but facts and anger. They have overplayed the hand, he said. Now we ask to see the evidence. The hearing was 4 days later, a Friday that smelled like rain. I wore my good suit again because suits are armor in rooms with flags. Elise sat beside me, quiet as a book. June colored apples. Their attorney presented photographs of my workshop as if work were a crime. He passed around bank statements with the numbers highlighted in hostile yellow and circled in accusing red. He tried to submit an affidavit from a home consultant who had never met me. The judge rejected it with a flick of her wrist that made the air in the room move. Then Miguel stood and did what I paid him to do. He asked the judge to take judicial notice of the criminal charges pending against Gavin that arose from the forensic report. He submitted the foundation documents. He submitted letters from the trades teachers who had already started bringing teenagers to the orchard to learn how to sharpen pruners properly. He submitted the confirmation from the home services company that the work order had been cancelled at my request. He submitted a letter from Pastor Grace that was, in its own way, a sermon on the perils of adult children who confuse inheritance with entitlement. Then he did something that made me sit up straighter. He called the Adult Protective Services social worker as a witness. She looked tired in a way public servants look tired, like a candle that persists after a night of being the only light. He asked her to explain how many reports had been made on me in the past month. 4, she said. He asked who made them. They were anonymous, she said. Miguel asked whether the reports shared common language. They did, she answered, and then, carefully, she read, confusion, fall risk, unsafe tools, high cash holdings, vulnerable, suggest guardianship. The judge looked at the petition in front of her. She looked at me. She looked at my daughter. Petition denied, she said, and then, blessedly, she lectured. She spoke about adult children with poor boundaries. She spoke about in-laws who overstep. She spoke about the court's limited patience for people who weaponize kindness. She spoke directly to Victor and Lorna and told them in the language of law that if they approached my property again without my express permission, they could consider their 3 p.m. plans cancelled for a date with the sheriff. The obnoxious thing about winning is that it does not give you back what you lost. I went home and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the half-moon stain Nora made the night she set a fresh roasted chicken down without a trivet. I put my hand over it and tried to absorb heat that was not there. Elise came in and placed a box of nails and a tape measure on the table beside me. "What is this?" I asked. "I am going to help build ladder shelves for the after-school program room at the store," she said. Miguel told me about the foundation. "I want to help with the useful and the beautiful." I looked up at her. The shape of her mouth is Nora's. The way she stands when she makes a decision is mine. "You do not need my permission," I said. "I need your instruction," she said. "I do not know how to make the angle cuts without wasting wood." I stood. We went to the workshop. I showed her how to set the miter saw. I showed her how to measure twice, cut once, the way my father had taught me. We made the first shelf together, quietly, like we had always had shelves between us that we were finally naming. In the weeks that followed, the case against Gavin moved with the slow inevitability of a weary system. Pleas were discussed. His parents, faced with their own civil suit for elder abuse, settled in a manner that made them publicly contrite and privately furious. The settlement assigned them debt. It gave the foundation first right of refusal on any property they tried to transfer to avoid collection. It included a clause that if they contacted June without Elisa's permission, the entire settlement would become due immediately in a sum that would make a man sell the watch he pretended not to care about. I did not want their ruin. I wanted them to stop. One evening, as the sun fell in that friendly way the orchard understands, Elise and I sat on the bench I had placed at the top of the rise. It looks over the rows of trees like a man surveying the work he loves. The bench has a shallow carving across the back rail. I cut it by hand with a gouge Nora had wrapped for me one Christmas. It says, in the funny script I use when I want to be careful, the work is the love. The love is the work. Mom would like that, Elise said, running her fingers over the letters. She would have corrected my grammar, I said. Then she would have fixed it. We laughed without merriment, but the laughter mattered. It made a sound in the air that had been almost too quiet. June ran down the rows chasing a grasshopper that did not intend to be caught. She flung her hair out of her face the way her grandmother used to fling flour from her hands. She called us to watch every 10 seconds. We watched. It felt like a promise we were making to ourselves in a language older than paper. In early autumn, Pastor Grace asked if she could hold a harvest service at the orchard. People came with blankets and baskets. The teenagers from the trades program set up tables they had built. The air smelled like apples and sawdust and something that might have been hope if hope had a smell. I stood and said a few words that are not worth recording. I am not a speech man. I am a make shelves and prune trees and slide nails into jars in color order man. But I said Nora's name into the air. I said my daughter's name. I said my granddaughter's name. I said something like, this is ours because we do the work. I said something like, I will keep it until my hands cannot. After we ate pie, Nora's almond crust recipe, which Ruth had mastered, down to the tilt you must give the pan to keep the filling even, Elise took the microphone. She said, I am sorry, into a crowd that did not need it and a father who did. She said, I am learning to notice, and that made my throat ache because it was the sentence I did not know I needed from her. She said, I am going to school for bookkeeping at night so I can help with the foundation without asking men who say they love me to check our math. The town applauded. It is a good town for applause, and this is luck, not a right, and I know it. It is nearly winter now as I write this, the orchard bones bare against a November sky. The judge signed the final orders. The foundation has its tax letter, and with it the permission to ask neighbors to put their money where their vows are. The store's after-school room hums with teenagers who have discovered that a hammer does not require your history to be neat. Gavin took a plea. He will have a record that makes it difficult to run a money-forward business for a while. His parents sold the house they had polished like a calling card. They moved to a rental where the carpet does not feel like theirs. They will survive. People like them do. Elise and I are practicing a new way to stand near each other without the old ease and without the old lies. Some days, she slips and defends a husband who does not deserve her defense. Some days, I snap and then apologize because I am not finished learning to be a man who does not think his endurance is a license to bark. June tells us both to be nice and then orders us pizza as if she runs a benevolent dictatorship. She draws apples. She corrects Pastor Grace in Sunday school in a way that makes the other children laugh. Sometimes, at night, when the house is quiet and every board in the floor knows my step, I take Nora's list from my wallet and read it like a prayer. Things that are ours.
Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel to help support the creation of more stories like this. Have a great day or evening.